Hello, welcome to Italics, the Italian American magazine. I'm your host, Anthony Tamburri. On this special edition of Italics, we'll spend the next half hour discussing A, the groundbreaking decision of Queens College and the CUNY Board of Trustees in approving graduate courses at Queens College, B, the significance of graduate courses in Italian American Studies, and C, how they contribute to a further promotion of Italian American history and culture in the United States. I'm joined today by two prominent professors who have been fundamental to Italian Americana, especially within the cultural realm. Dr. Jo Bona is Professor of Italian American Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at Stony Brook University, and Dr. Fred Gardaphe is our Distinguished Professor of English and Italian American Studies at Queens College. Both professors have been teaching graduate courses in Italian American Studies as far back as the late 1980s. Welcome to the both of you to Italics.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
Now, I started out by mentioning graduate courses at Queens College. Perhaps you can run us through, in a couple of minutes, the history of how this came about.
Well, Queens College has been the literal birthplace of Italian American Studies at the university level with the work that Richard Gambino did back in the 1970s. And subsequently, through the Calandra Institute, Queens College has created courses in the undergraduate level in Italian American Studies. I've had many students all over the years at the graduate level continue to ask me for courses in Italian American Studies, and wherever I've been, it's been very difficult to create those. Queens kind of opened the door, and with the work at the Calandra Institute, we were able to, at least through the Master of Arts in Liberal Science program, create courses so that people could take. And I think what we're going to get there's a lot of people who are teaching Italian, teaching English, teaching history, who want to get more knowledge of Italian American culture.
Now, all three of us, as I said, for the past couple of decades, have been teaching Italian American Studies at the graduate level, but it's been not catch as catch can, but always special topics. And in this sense, I think, and both Fred and I are from Queens, so we're sort of tooting our own horn, but it is unique. It doesn't exist, although Italian American Studies at the graduate level exists even before we started.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I'll take this up a little bit. I have to say the historians in the field of ethnic studies have been instrumental in making possible what I do today as a literary critic. And people such as Virginia Jans McLaughlin and Donna Gabacha's work at the Immigration History Research Center in Minneapolis have been instrumental in not only teaching me how to think more comparatively about Italian American Studies, but in mentoring a whole generation of PhDs in history. And in some ways, they provide the three of us with a paradigm for how to do that in Italian studies and in English studies.
Mm-hmm. We who had no mentors.
We didn't, not in this field, even though we were encouraged, at least I was at my alma mater, University of Wisconsin, to do this work, but I had to look at other paradigms of area studies like African American studies, women's and gender studies, to figure out how to think about Italian American studies.
Because in both your cases, you come out of English departments for your graduate work, for your PhD.
Exactly.
And you each had to get what we might call a non-Italian Americanist to direct your dissertations, because there weren't any, there were, as you said, there were people in history, but there really weren't any in graduate programs, I think we can say, in literary studies and sort of cultural studies in general. There were people out there who may have been doing Italian American studies in the cultural realm. But they weren't involved, for whatever reason, in graduate programs.
And that made it hard to know that they existed, because there was no institution or infrastructure that supported it. I had to look at other fields to help me think about Italian American literary studies. So I went to an African American scholar, Bill Andrews, who made it possible for me to do the kind of work I'm doing today. So that's just one example.
And I went to Levon Ruoff in American Indian Studies.
Exactly.
Who did the same thing. And I think we're stronger because of that. Because we have read outside of the Italian. And I don't think you can be Italian American unless somebody else has African American, Jewish American, Asian American, and so on. And having read in all those, we were able to, so I think it helped us in a way.
Oh, it did. I mean, I think that and I know I don't want to preempt any of our questions, but I think our future really stands in an area that's more comparative, that gets us talking outside the box of a specific orientation of ethnicity.
Yeah, when you talked about going to other fields and looking for paradigms, and I was thinking of Solar's consent and descent that a lot of people jumped onto, but in some ways, historically, it already existed in Italian American studies with Rose Basile Green.
Yes.
It's just that her book didn't have the play back in the 70s within the larger Italian American community that instead someone like a Solar's had within ethnic
but she
studies.
wasn't speaking the language. She wasn't speaking the jargon, the theory stuff that she had the ideas. She was doing the readings. And of course, theory is inherent in a reading, whether you know it or not. You're doing some kind of theory work, but she just didn't have the right language. And I think what this program does is it puts us into the institution and puts us into kind of a national data bank of. So when you're looking for a graduate Italian American study, boom, it'll come up now.
Yeah, yeah. So we have 4 courses at Queens. They're basically all literary and cultural, cinema. But we have some other colleagues over there. You also have colleagues at Stony Brook.
Yes.
Who do and will contribute
Absolutely.
to Italian American studies besides yourself. So.
Well, we were lucky enough to get Peter Caravetta. I believe we stole him from Queens College.
Indeed, you did.
And he's been a very
It was a trade.
Yes, he's
Player
been
to
a
be named.
very, very important colleague, though, because he thinks outside certain paradigms already. So he brings a much more theoretical and philosophical approach to migration and mobility, which allows us to think about ethnic groups vis-a-vis other ethnic groups outside of the idea of just nationhood. So Peter's been instrumental in making my thinking more nuanced as we move forward in the field, because we're somewhere else than we were in the 1980s, when we would have maybe 1 or 2 graduate students sitting in on our undergraduate classes and then doing a paper, because that's really how it started, at that kind of grassroots level.
Yeah, and if we were to sort of continue a little bit, looking back, the history of Italian American graduate studies, you said before, you mentioned 2 prominent historians, who have actually brought forth, trained some really excellent historians today who are out there doing work. And of course, there was sociology. There were a couple of our retired colleagues at CUNY, whether it's Richard Gambino, whether it's Jerry Crace, whom we've mentioned. Of course, Bob Viscusi is still
well, and my predecessor, Phil Canestraro, was instrumental.
Phil Canestraro. So, but there was an organization that helped us also, right? The American Italian Historical Association.
Which is now called the Italian American Studies
And oddly enough, 3 past presidents are sitting here.
Oh, my heavens.
You know,
sitting here.
The thing about Italian American studies is that you not only have to do the work, you have to do the work that enables the other work to be done. And that's the hard part about it. But it's when you do it right, like I think we've built a foundation. I think that the future can begin to shape itself.
Yeah.
I think that Italian American Studies, our association now, is again in a very different place, even when I was probably the most recent past president among the 3 of us. And I'm happy for that. And at Hofstra University hosted our last conference just in November, and Stanislaw Pugliese was part of the support of that. And what I saw at that conference was really cutting-edge work done by younger, thank God, graduate students, not only in history, but also in creative writing and in literature. So I was pleased to see some of the important work being done by some of our former students, like Michelle Fazio and others that we've mentored along the way.
Yeah, yeah, and now it's called the Italian American Studies Association, so people should know that. What used to be called AHA, or the American Italian Italian Historical Association, is now Italian American Studies. Historically, that move had to be made, don't you think?
We tried to make it. May I talk about
You
this?
can talk about it.
We tried to make it happen in 1996. Phil Conestraro and I were on this duo committee, and we put forth a motion to try to suggest the interdisciplinary nature of the term Italian American Studies versus the sort of misnomer of American Italian Historical Association, which people can misunderstand to think that only perhaps historians would be involved in, among other things. But we didn't win that conversation in 1996. But I'm happy to say that George Guida and a group of younger scholars got it to happen. What was it, in 2010 or?
Pun intended. George Guida guided it through.
Yes, he guided it through, drove it through, and we're pleased about it. And I'm sure that our idea about the name is going to now affect how it gets.
But see, this is something I think that this is a perfect example of what happens when you do not institutionalize something. People want to hold on to whatever it is they have because they don't trust the next generation because they haven't seen them to fit to take over. I totally trust the next generation, and that's why we created these programs so that we can create that next generation who will then create another generation. I mean, that's how you institutionalize
Absolutely.
things.
And by the institutionalizing it, we can then, in some ways, move back to where you guys began, and that is dealing with other ethnic groups, other disciplines. And that was another topic I wanted to bring up, and that is the relationship of Italian American Studies to other disciplines, as well as to other ethnic groups.
Well, you have a series, multi-ethnic.
Well, I could talk about that just briefly. SUNY's been wonderful about sort of supporting this idea of the interdisciplinary of literary studies. So I have a series in multi-ethnic studies, which includes, certainly single topic studies are welcome, but it encourages more of a conversation among ethnic groups. So that's really important. But I also think that, and I have to tell both of you this morning, I actually sat down and did a Google search on Italian American graduate studies programs, and it led me to undergraduate programs in this country, which is not surprising. But the other thing it led me to are certain other area studies programs that we might think about as we try to institutionalize Italian American studies on the graduate level, and that includes such things as American Studies, specific departments that already have a lot of support, like Italian Studies at certain kinds of universities, et cetera. And we need to think about area studies as a specific model. And the other thing that we might think about sort of structurally is many graduate students are still very discipline bound. They're in history, they're in sociology, they're in English. Well, I think we should work hard to develop a kind of certificate program in Italian American Studies, like we did in Women's and Gender Studies. So we get students from all over the map, social sciences and humanities, getting this certificate, and it really, really increases their cultural cachet. And I think it will do that for graduate students in Italian American Studies.
When I bring up Italian Studies is where does Italian American Studies belong, right?
Well, I think one of the things you'll find out was when I went to Stony Brook and we started building Italian American Studies, the Italian program started growing. And what I described it as was it's the back door to Italian studies. In other words, students take these courses in Italian American Studies and say, wow, I'm interested in the language, I'm interested further in the culture, and that encourages them to take more courses so that they don't have to take courses that are just in Italian. And so what we have, I think, is a way to build both programs. And I think it's the same with American Studies, because when I was at Stony Brook, I made sure that I became director of American Studies specifically so that I could work with Italian American Studies and insert it into the area studies model that Mary Jo was talking about. So we need to do that. And I think, our eye is on the Graduate Center.
And you, Mary Jo, you're in two different departments. Or two different disciplines, let's say.
Yes.
Right? Because you're in the Department of
Cultural Analysis and Theory, which was a merger between Women's and Gender Studies and Comp Lit and Cultural Studies. And it didn't have anything to do with our sort of eminent love for each other. It had to do with budgetary problems at our university. But having done that, it connects back to what Fred was saying, allows those of us in Women's and Gender Studies to say, now we can build a PhD program because we're under an imprimatur of a department.
Right.
And so we can now build a program in Women's and Gender Studies. And I know I'll be teaching a course on feminist theory next year, and of course I'm going to incorporate, like I began my career, some kind of theoretical work on Italian-American studies and literary studies.
Yeah. What's the importance of Italian-American graduate studies in the community at large?
Education more and more is becoming accepted by the community at large. In other words, when I was going away to school, people used to laugh at me. And in fact, in my neighborhood, they used to say when somebody was in college, that meant that they were in jail. So the first time I came back home, came home from college, someone said, "Where you been? I haven't seen you for a while." I said, "Oh, I was at college." I go, "Oh, okay. I got you." And so that's where it kind of started, this idea. And even when I went to Fenwick High School, which is a prep school, and they would call me the professor when I was a kid, because I'd have to wear my blazer and my tie and my shirt, and I'd come to work and they'd say, "Oh, the professor is here, the professor." So there was this kind of joking about it, and I think the first kind of level of Italian-American businessmen who have made it without education. But they all made sure that their children went to school. And I think we're finally at the point now where this next level of the community leadership are college-educated people who really understand the importance of college. And for those who don't, what I do when I go to meetings and talk to people is I say, well, you have a friend who's a plumber, you have a friend who's a lawyer, you have a friend who's a... I'm your friend in higher education. I mean, what do I need a friend there? I said, you got kids? Oh, I got a lot of kids in college. So do they ever have any problems? Oh, yeah, send them to me. So they understood the personal contact of that. So I think we're at a point now where the community is beginning to understand it a little bit more. They don't quite know yet how to use us. And that's something we have to teach them. We have to show them that what we create is valuable to them, is essential. And a lot of times what happens is in my classes, I have students who go home and then start telling their parents what they learned in school. And it's like, then the parents start coming, at the undergraduate level, the parents start coming to the classes.
And they start reading the books.
Yes.
And yeah, exactly. And so that's, I think, the value that we have. But as long as we keep it real, as long as we're not like over-theorizing and getting lost in some kind of academic jargon that they won't, as long as we make it matter to them on the streets, I think we're on our way to the beginnings of a great relationship.
And I agree with that idea that it starts at the undergraduate level. One of the favorite books of Italian Americana is Marie Hall Etz's transcription of Rosa Cassateri's story. And I can't tell you how many aunts, grandmothers, mothers, uncles I've had come to the classroom and having read that book. So you try to make sure these books stay in print. This is a very important editorial thing we need to continue doing, and make them accessible and available, and passing them on from our students to their families. That's one of the ways in which you make a bridge between the academy and the community. I think my bigger concern about the community is the academic community that has, continues to see us as almost invisible. And we've had to work very, very hard within our own institutions and in the larger institution of, for example, the MLA, the Modern Language Association, to make our presence known to other academic groups that this is an important area of concentration.
Yeah, it is still a struggle in spite of the fact that from around the early 90s and on, there's just been an explosion of books published by major presses, university presses, something like the academic presses, like the non-university academic presses like Palgrave and Routledge and things of that sort. Right, exactly. There's been just a plethora of books, and yet we're still sort of fighting that fight.
But it's better. It's getting better.
Yeah,
It's
it
better.
is. Sure,
I'm not
without
being
a doubt.
People like
It's
Mary
getting
Jo are
better.
being asked to keynote address conferences, and
Exactly.
we're asked, and we're
That are
given-
not Italian American.
Right.
That's what's
Well,
exciting.
that's
That's
the
what's
key.
important.
No,
that's
the
what's
key.
significant about it, that it's
Exactly.
not an Italian-American conference
Right.
or predominantly Italian-American, but rather a multi-ethnic literature.
Exactly.
Right.
And the
it's
other
MELIS.
keynoters,
It's MELIS,
right.
we should say. It's MELIS, right?
It's the Multi-Ethnic
Yeah.
Literature of the United States Association, and the other keynoters are a famous African Americanist
And a famous Asian.
and a famous Asian Americanist.
And so now we have a famous Italian-American.
Oh, my
Well,
goodness.
as well.
absolutely.
But,
Sure.
but,
By all means.
but it's good to be in the conversation.
Right,
And I'd
exactly.
like them to be there so they can hear a little bit about this particular literary culture.
And the other conversation we have to join is the one in Italy. as you know, Fred,
I've been working
because
on this.
you,
I
you've
believe
already,
the future.
you taught there for a semester.
I believe the future of Italian American studies is in Italy. You know, and I said that once at a conference, and a professor said, "You're totally wrong." He says, "America has all the resources," and I said, "You're overlooking the greatest resource you have in this country." And he says, "Well, what's that?" I said, "Your graduate students. The Italian graduate students are doing work that's incredible today, coming over to, some of them come to the United States, give up their lives in Italy and do great work. The ones who stay in Italy are more and more trying to convince their professors that Italian American Studies is," and I once gave a lecture at the Center for American Studies in Rome on Italian American Studies as the entree into American Studies. So it wasn't, I do Italian American Studies for the sake of doing Italian American Studies. How Italian graduate students would be so much better served if they entered American Studies through Italian American. Go wherever else you want to go. Typically, they're drawn to African American, Native American subjects just because of the way they've been portrayed on, you know, what they've seen on television and cultural news and films and so on. So the argument, I think, is that Italy needs to start paying attention to the mass immigration that happened and the result of that. And I think the way to do it is through Italian American Studies. It's beginning, as you know, beginning to happen.
Right.
But to get, I mean, it's like the battles that we fought in American Studies in the United States. Now we have to go to Italy
Well, and there have been some people at the ground level for a good 25 years in Italy. The Maddalena Tirabassi, Emilio Francina, Stefano Lucconi. I mean, these are people who've
Very
been
involved
working
in Italian
for
American.
years on this. And then some people came along afterwards, the journalist Gian Antonio Stella, who did the book Lorda, and so on and so forth. So there's been a lot going on in Italy, but sort of like what had been going on here a good 35, 40 years ago, individuals, little groups of individuals. But we still don't have it as part and parcel of the general discourse, I think.
No, but I think more and more as Italy begins to realize that it is a land of immigration and not emigration, they're going to look to America as the model for how that was processed, at least in the past, historically, and they can't not see what, you know, the incredibly large emigration from Italy into the United States, and that history that will help them understand what's going on in Italy today.
That's a good point.
Yeah. We've been dealing basically with graduate studies because of what has taken place at Queens College this past fall, but on a couple of occasions you've mentioned undergraduate programs, and we should mention that there are undergraduate programs out there. There's one, of course, at Stony Brook.
Yes. Stony Brook, there are several programs, and I was surprised that most of them have minors. They don't have majors. And the only place that I could find here in New York was Lehman.
Right, Lehman College.
Has a BA major in it. I don't know enough about it, but in Italian American Studies. And, you know, this is not unusual demographically. This rings true that they tend all to be in the Northeast or in California. And California State University at Long Beach has, they mentioned Italian American Studies, but then when I went to their website, I only found information on Italian Studies.
Right,
and I couldn't find
growing.
classes. They're growing. So they're growing.
Coming into it.
We need to say these things
That's
out
Professor
loud.
Florinda Donato.
Exactly.
Yes.
So Brooklyn College has the minor. Queens College has the minor.
Minor. I would never argue for a major.
You wouldn't, and why not?
Because I think, just as I don't believe there should be a major in African American, Jewish American, so I think the major should be American Studies.
Okay.
And then within that, you do the minor in Italian American,
Interesting.
African American, and so on.
That's a good model.
That's the model I've been trying to work with. And also, what serves a major in Italian American Studies? I mean, what can you, I mean, I don't believe that undergraduate education needs to have a practical outcome, but you have to make that argument constantly, especially these days when you're introducing new programs to administrations that are not wanting to spend money on the programs that are already there.
Exactly.
So I lay low with the minor, get the students, take the courses, and with a minor you can build 6 courses into it, 8 I think at the most, and get students interested, and so that by the graduate level, which is where we're at now, we'll have courses, and then certainly at the PhD would be the certificate. I think that's the model to go by.
Who's been really fundamental, a good 30, 40, 50 years.
Doing-
Someone we didn't mention, we really needed to mention, is Rudy Vega.
I think he was so fundamental. At the beginning of my career, I got a grant to go to the immigration history research, and I spent every day with him at lunch, and then went back to the stacks. And I won't forget how important that experience was as a young scholar.
I had the same. I got a scholarship to go up there to the collection. Spent all that time with Rudy, and and Rudy was there to write key recommendations at points in my career when he was like one of the few scholars who could transcend Italian American studies and have cachet outside the field. He would always write letters. I mean, and this is something I don't think people understand.
Exactly.
That's part of our job too, which sometimes it can be very demanding, but to guide that next generation, to nourish them, and to advocate for that. That's what Rudy was. Rudy was a strong advocate of young graduate students.
And he crossed borders intellectually all the time. He knew a lot about literature, even though he was a historian. He's the one who found the manuscript of Rosa Casateri at the Hull House in Chicago. So he was cutting edge and innovative in ways that I don't think were deeply appreciated at the time, but he continued forward.
And when I think of Rudy, I think of the first proceedings, quote unquote, of the American Italian Historical
look what he
Association,
did.
which was on the novel.
Exactly.
And it had also people like John Cammett, who was a professor of history, Italian history, and who was also interested in his own way in Italian American studies. History, obviously, as well as sociology, but history obviously was really the discipline, it seems, the most important discipline in pushing this forward from at the beginning.
And interestingly enough, they put Puzo on the Italian American Studies map.
Yeah.
The social scientists did.
Yeah.
And it was only thereafter that the literary historians caught up with them. So it's wonderful to know that.
And we're definitely going to be, you and I definitely are going to be working together on a daily basis. You and the three of us,
I
of
want to
course,
come and
work
teach
together.
a course.
Well, you know what I was thinking? We should create a joint SUNY CUNY
A
certificate.
consortium, yes, and a certificate.
And I think, well, that's something.
Born here.
It's
The idea is born
here.
here.
Great
right on
idea.
television. Great, wonderful.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
want to
Thank
thank you
you,
both for
Anthony.
taking time out.
Thanks.
Well, that's it for this edition of Italics. Before closing, I'm delighted to acknowledge that this episode marks 25 years to the day when Italics broadcast its first show. We will have more on this milestone in future episodes. I'm Anthony Tamburri. Thanks for watching. Arrivederci alla prossima puntata.
Italics, the Italian American magazine.